Good afternoon, uh, everybody, or good morning, or wherever you are. So I am Eric Kennis from the Egmont Institute in Brussels, and it's really a big honor for us and a pleasure, of course, to welcome Professor Stephen Weissman, who has a long experience in and with Congo, Zaire, and Africa more in general. It's one of the foremost experts. As you probably know, he did his PhD on the US political and military intervention in Congo. This resulted in a book, which is a bit of a classic in this field of research, which is called American Foreign Policy in the Congo. It deals with the period 60-64, very turbulent period. So afterwards, he's been teaching at the university in Kisangani and at the end of the 60s, and he was the scapegoat for student protests at the university at the time, where the Mobutu regime exposed him for alleged involvement in student protests, which were politically very unwelcome at the time. This episode was described in detail in his latest book, which was published last year. I don't know if you can see it if I show it. It's called From the Congo to Capitol Hill. So this part in the Congo was about his teaching in Kisangani. The second part of the book goes about Capitol Hill. So after the return of Professor Weissman from the Congo in June 71, he went to academics. But as everybody who is a little bit busy with the Congo knows, Congo never leaves you alone. It's impossible. And so Congo came back. After some hearings at Congress, he started working in 79 for the House of Representatives Africa Subcommittee for the Democratic Party. And so this is the second part of the book by Professor Weissman, where he talks about his confrontation with US policy towards Mobutu at the time. And he details all the fights he had to do in relation to human rights policy towards Zaire, military policy, etc. In 1990, it was finished, and then he returned to academics. And I think that his involvement in Congress also resulted in a book which was called A Culture of Deference, Congress's Failure of Leadership in Foreign Policy. So we're really very pleased to welcome you, Professor, for a talk about a very, very actual and very interesting subject, I think, which is US foreign policy towards the Congo. So thank you very much. We'll have Professor Weissman talk, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A session. You can put your questions in French or in English as you wish, and as you see, you can write them down in the queue. If you push the Q&A button, you can write the questions, and so we'll deal with them afterwards. So thank you very much again, Professor Weissman.
Thank you very much, Eric. And it's a great opportunity you provided to try to think through this question of understanding American foreign policy in the Congo with an international audience. Understanding not only what happened, but also what happened is crucial in analyzing American foreign policy toward the Congo as well as other places. To answer the why question, one needs to first fully comprehend the US's actual objectives, including, most importantly, the assumptions upon which these goals are based. And secondly, recognize that these perspectives are not random individual thoughts. The perspectives of the policymakers are reflections of either their own previous experiences outside social and political groups or their current ones within government bureaucracies. So I've taken three close looks at this why question. As Eric mentioned, my 1974 book on the 60s, in which I had the opportunity to interview almost all the important US policymakers in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations. This was before archives were released, but when they were released, aside for a couple of minor mistakes, I found they kind of upheld what I'd gotten through the interviews. Later, I followed subsequent developments in Congo policy based on archives and further interviews. My new book, as Eric mentioned, is based on something else. It's participant observation. I was the key congressional staffer interacting with officials of the Carter, Reagan, and Bush, George H.W. Bush administrations from 1979 to 1991. And finally, over the last 10 years, I've been active in what was called the Congo Working Group, which was a coalition of non-governmental organizations and experts that was pressing administrations, Congress to advance democratization, anti-corruption measures, and the reduction of internal violence. And after the 2018 election, finally, I wrote an article based largely on interviews with the 10 key US policymakers at the time in Washington regarding the DRC, discussing why, and Washington and the embassy, US Embassy, discussing why the United States accepted fraudulent results. So to eliminate any suspense you may have, let me just briefly state my broad conclusions, then I'll go into detail. During the 1960s, amidst intense Cold War tension and large-scale African decolonization, Congo-Kinshasa was seen by US decision makers as an important prize because of its size, its resources, its strategic location in Africa. US policies in the 60s were shaped mainly by two distinct categories of upper-class elites, outsiders to the government who came in mainly to the State Department and whose previous social and political experiences had, as I mentioned, taken place outside of the executive branch for the most part. One group under the Republican President Eisenhower was upper class, conservative, pro-European. The other under Democratic Presidents Kennedy and Johnson was upper class, liberal, and sympathetic to at least moderate third world nationalism. These varying perspectives of the three administrations influenced the ways that each interpreted alleged communist threats, influenced their choices as to which Congolese politicians they favored, influenced the relative priorities they set for protecting Western European relations versus Afro-Asian country relations in the United States. Then by the 1980s, the second time period I want to look at, Zaire's importance, it was renamed by Mobutu Zaire, to American decision makers has significantly decreased. The number of independent African countries had mushroomed. Real world experience had diminished the fear of the communists taking over the Congo. So as a result of all that, US policy, which had been set by the top decision makers before, was increasingly consigned to lower levels of the US government, especially bureaucrats from the State Department's Africa Bureau. And that trend has persisted until this very day. Although there were somewhat different policy emphases under different presidents, the Democrat Carter stressed human rights more, the Republican Reagan, emphasized supporting friends like Mobutu, the head of the country, and Republican George H.W. Bush was president during the wave of democratization in Africa, but he still stopped short of casting off Mobutu. The key to me is the bottom line of all these administrations, all three of these administrations, was that the State Department bureaucracy was unwilling to risk its relationship with a decaying client regime, the Mobutu regime. It was unwilling to re-examine its early 1960s judgment that the country would fall apart if the regime were disturbed, and therefore the US was incapable of taking a long-term view of political stability in the Congo and effective governance in the Congo. Now, as we all know, in the late 1990s, the regime decayed further under Mobutu and ultimately collapsed into regional and internal wars that killed at least 3.5 million people. This only temporarily caused higher levels of the Clinton and George Bush administrations to take notice more of the Congo. They supported an African-led peacemaking process because the whole region was aflame. But that included also democratic elections in the Congo. What about today? In this era, first let's look at Obama, Democratic president, then Republican Trump and Democratic Biden. The US policy has resumed its low priority for US policymakers, for the top policymakers. Both the Kabila and Tshisekedi governments have mostly failed to make very significant progress toward effective democratic governance, at least so far. All three administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, did offer rhetorical support for various reforms. But the State Department Africa Bureau's risk-averse focus on short-term over long-term political stability has continued to hold sway. The bureaucracy does not want to take a chance on actually departing from support of the existing regime. Now, none of these American policies, as it turns out, really have advanced the long-term political stability and governance that are the official goals of US policy. In other words, the operational goals of the US have been in contradiction with its official goals. Okay, let's look a little more detail at each of these periods. The 60s, under Eisenhower. Eisenhower's policymakers were sympathetic to corporate-led social stability in the newly independent Congo, and they accepted the Belgians' view that the Congolese were unprepared for independence and required tutelage. This orientation, along with other NATO allies' positions, which were similar to Belgium's, influenced the Americans' view of what to do. And the army mutinied, and Katanga seceded from the country with Belgian government support. The policymakers in the US largely sided with Belgium's resistance to the United Nations using its discretion under Security Council resolutions to act to begin to reduce the secession. It was this, it's very important to note that it was this conservative pro-European stance of the Eisenhower administration that governed its first reactions in the Congo and that led Lumumba to help lead him to appeal for Soviet assistance against Katanga. And that in turn triggered the second perspective of the administration, which was the fear of communism. These policymakers talked to me about a chaos to communism syndrome. They were looking at their experiences elsewhere in the world, Eastern Europe, Greece, Malaya, Philippines, Egypt, Guinea, and they saw dangers. And they even were sort of paranoid concerning how much modest Soviet military aid and allegedly, though pro-communist advisors, it turns out they weren't really pro-communist, reflected this fear reflected their lack of understanding and sympathy for these new nationalisms, like the Lumumba government in the Congo. These are kind of upper class, Republican, socially conservative people. They're not down there, with the masses, and they see these phenomena and they really don't understand them. So they magnify the communist influence. And of course, under that influence, under that fear, they helped with Belgium overthrow Lumumba. With Belgium, they were complicit in his assassination, and they supported Mobutu's coup. Okay, now why is this? As I've just indicated, the top advisors, people like the Secretary of State Herter, the acting secretary often, Douglas Dillon, who I interviewed, Robert Murphy, whom I interviewed, who went to the independence ceremonies, the ambassador in Belgium, William Burden. Basically, these were upper class, social register, corporate, European oriented in terms of their experience Republicans. Little passion for civil rights. A few had some material interests, actually, in what they called the Cake to Katanga complex. But I looking very carefully at all these influences, I did not feel that that was the critical element. There were not enough of them at high levels who had that. All right, then we go to the JFK and LBJ administrations. What about their perspectives? The top officials had a greater understanding of and sympathy with nationalism, but they still feared communist subversion. Maybe they didn't see everybody, the communists, as all powerful, but they still would prefer not to have anybody having any significant relations with the Soviets or Chinese. They were willing sometimes to experiment sort of with leftists, like in Ghana and Guinea, but only where absolutely necessary. In other words, where the leftists were in power and they had to kind of accept them for a while. So they, in Congo, they supported what they considered a non-racial, moderate Adula government against what they considered, leftist, Lumumbist opposition. Second, because of their sympathy with nationalisms, they worked with the Afro-Asian countries at the UN to bring about the end of the Katanga secession, which of course was seen as a white extremist-supported secession. And the Kennedy administration's thrust continued under the conservative Lyndon B. Johnson, but there was a little more room for hardline fear of especially Chinese influence. And therefore, for example, the US pushed Belgium to abandon its efforts to negotiate with rebels when the Lumumbists rebelled in 1964. Okay, so why was this the case? Why did they support Adula instead of a hardline military regime? Why did they finally, after hesitation, go after Katanga, allow the UN to do so? The reason is that many of the key policymakers, people like Bowles, Chester Bowles, Assistant Secretary G. Menon Williams, and his deputy Wayne Fredericks, Harlan Cleveland, Adlai Stevenson, they were upper-class liberals with strong public service rather than corporate careers. Many of them were elective Democratic politicians and had third world and UN experience. And there were a couple of others of different orientations of the administration, but for time reasons, let's just pass over them. Under LBJ, most of them stayed in there, but he brought in Averell Harriman, who was kind of more hardline type during the rebellions as an Undersecretary of State. Again, Harriman had a background that in some respects was a combination of the way the Eisenhower people were and the Kennedy people were. He had an upper-class business background, but he had long-time government posts dealing with Moscow. Okay, get to the 80s. This is subject of the second half of my book, my experience with Congress. And here I get to know a lot of the officials better, and I'm working with them or they're working on me. And it becomes obvious by this time that the corrupt and repressive Mobutu regime is unreformable and potentially unstable. Privately, most of them understand this. Most policymakers understand this. And it's also understood that there's a pretty reduced communist threat. I heard very little in these days about, oh gosh, if Mobutu goes, the communists are going to take over. This was the 1980s. People had more experience with what had happened in Africa. Still, in spite of that, the US remained unable to contemplate any policy suggesting that Zaire could ever be a good partner with the US without Mobutu. He was considered, and they actually said this in cables, our man, because he'd been put into power twice by the CIA. And the idea was, well, maybe communism isn't an immediate threat, but who knows what could happen if Mobutu left power? Maybe there could be a bloody return to the rebellions of the 60s where the whole country would fall apart. In testifying before our committee, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Richard Moose, himself a veteran of the Foreign Service, told Congress, no one has been able to demonstrate or to describe how basic human rights might be assured during a period of abrupt and complete change of government, how vital economic and political interests of the United States would be safeguarded during that process. Indeed, it requires an act of intellectual and logical juju. For those unacquainted, that's African folk magic, to posit a situation of the sort which is described by the critics of the regime, and to accept that as a basis for national foreign policy. And in fact, the Secretary of State himself, Cyrus Vance, said similar things during the Shaba crisis, which occurred in the late 70s. So even though the Carter administration officials would bring up human rights with Mobutu, even though they gave military aid and so forth, but it wasn't huge, they still kept supporting the regime. And the Reagan and Bush administrations tried, at least, to be more generous to their friend. And they also, of course, supported the regime. Okay, what's the explanation? Why are the US actors behaving this way in the 1980s when the communist threat is not seen as important anymore? Well, the key actor from the 1980s to today in American foreign policy was the Bureau of African Affairs in the State Department, sometimes including past members of the Africa Bureau who would be brought back in, sometimes in a higher position. So the top policymakers have dealt very little with the DRC since the 1980s. Why? This reflects Zaire's decreasing importance among US interests. And what about the Bureau? Why is the Bureau doing this? Basically, you start with the historically based fear of change from the 60s. Oh, what could happen? And it became embedded in the Bureau. It was kind of like part of the atmosphere of the Bureau was this memory. It was stamped by the Bureau's first experiences in the DRC. But more than that, there's a typical bureaucratic syndrome you find in the State Department elsewhere and in many bureaucracies that are domestic bureaucracies, that bureaucracies are organizations. So as organizations, they tend to choose short-range, low-risk options. In this case, it was supporting the US client regime, rather than imagine and promote longer range, more uncertain alternatives. If the organizations, say, chose to kind of freely consider, what can we do? What are the different choices? Maybe we should take a chance and see what will happen in the future. But it was not accepted by the higher ups, or it didn't work. The organization itself could be jeopardized. Its standing would be less. Its prestige would be less. People could, lose their jobs. A very revealing quote from the former National Security Council officer for the Iran encapsulated this. He was asking, why is it the US stayed with the Shah of Iran so long? And he said, the reason was that no one wanted to make the call. No one in the Middle East Bureau or State Department wanted to take the chance of saying it's time for us to, loosen our relationship with the Shah. It became, these bureaucracies are interested in preserving their organization. Now contrast that with an individual person. An individual is not part of an organization, or she's not part of an organization. She can scan the whole range of options. And so what? If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. You're not a member of an organization. You as an individual. Okay, your standing might decrease, but you're freer to consider things. The other thing about the Africa Bureau and the State Department is these organizations are strongly hierarchical. Dissent, and sometimes even objective reporting unfavorable to the regime was discouraged. We had testimony when I was working for Congress from the political counselor of the US Embassy in the late 70s and early 80s. And he basically was fired because he dissented from policy and because he wanted to make more frank human rights reports. And finally, with regard to the State Department, as other people have pointed out, there's almost no professional training except for language training. So these are very smart people, and I'm sure their intentions, I know their intentions are good, but often they don't have the equipment to make the kind of analysis that would have been useful there. And this is based, again, partly on my own experience and relations with them. There's an excellent PhD thesis by Elise Forbes Pachter, comes to similar conclusions about the Africa Bureau. Well, while I was there in Congress, there was a new outsider influence, and that was the post-Vietnam US Congress. And I worked with liberal congressmen who, in the aftermath of Vietnam, were more critical of American foreign policy, pro more human rights, and we were able to succeed in gradually reducing the military assistance to Mobutu. And for more of that and the difficulties we had, I think you might enjoy looking at my book. One illustration of all of this is we took a trip to Zaire and with a congressional delegation of 7 members of Congress plus staff. And we, went to talk to people of all different persuasions. We met with a group of opposition parliamentarians, including the father of the current president, Etienne Tshisekedi. And after we met with them, they walked down from a hotel to the parking lot, and they were attacked by, obviously, a police-type group. They were beaten, their cars were smashed, and they were put in prison, the prison near where Mobutu was. And the congressional delegation, which was actually bipartisan, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, tried to protest. But the ambassador kept discouraging us. He said, well, don't prejudge. We don't know what happened. We don't know what the government knew. Obviously, it was organized. We decided, oh, we're not going to go to lunch with Mobutu the next day. Well, the ambassador was livid. You have to do this and so forth. Finally persuaded them. Okay, finally, they came to a compromise with the Congress. We'll go to see the president, but we won't eat lunch with him. and they sent a protest letter. Well, during that trip, the embassy officers told us they were glad we came because before that, they were not even allowed to speak to the opposition. And finally, after we had met with Mobutu, he agreed to release the imprisoned ex-parliamentarian oppositionists. They came to the hotel all beaten and bloody and so forth, bandaged. And we said, okay, well, we have a doctor with our delegations. Let the doctor examine them and see, what happened to them. And the ambassador ordered the doctor to stop examining them. He says, well, doctor's not that qualified. He was an army doctor, just looking at superficial wounds and broken bones. So that was an extreme form of this bureaucratic timidity that sometimes in the State Department themselves, they often call this clientitis, where the embassy sees not the US government anymore, but the regime that it's with as the client. Okay, then as we get toward the final stage here, after the Mobutu regime collapsed in the late 90s, regional and internal wars killing millions of people, the higher levels of the Clinton and George W. Bush administration did become temporarily involved in regional peacemaking. And part of that was a democratic election in the DRC. And there was a later manifestation of high-level interest in where there was a major regional conflict when Obama appointed Senator Russell Feingold, former Senator Russell Feingold, to work on ending the Congo-Rwanda conflict with M23 rebels supported by Rwanda in 2012. Okay, what about now? Obama, Trump, Biden. Okay, what are their perspectives? Basically, you had an authoritarian, corrupt president, Joseph Kabila, maneuvering to avoid scheduled elections, even as internal and regional pressures were mounting for him to hold these elections. What did the Democratic President Obama do? He offered uplifting pro-democracy rhetoric, said it was democracy was our prime interest in the Congo, but still failed to exert sufficient effective pressure to get Kabila to hold scheduled 2016 elections. At the time, again, I was in this Congo working group. We were trying to lobby the US government on this. And the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, well, herself a veteran of the Africa Bureau, Linda Thomas Greenfield, almost always managed to detect remnants of hope in Kabila's fairly negative conduct and opposed for a long time more sanctions on his aides, his collaborators, pressuring him strongly to hold these elections. So there's a continuity here. Now, there were some new outsiders in this Obama period. I mentioned liberal former Congressman Feingold, who took an interest in the domestic DRC, and former liberal Congressman Tom Perriello. They were appointed special envoys, mainly for regional issues, but they both got involved in the DRC. And there were a bunch of NGOs that were supporting them. Together, they actually achieved a moderate stiffening of the US policy on the DRC elections. Feingold started funding the Catholic Church to begin an election observation program. And during Perriello's time, he was fighting with Linda Thomas Greenfield's people. They got a few sanctions on officials. Under Trump, then Trump comes in. Again, this is around 2017. And suddenly, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, recently a Republican candidate for president, somehow took a personal interest in the DRC humanitarian crisis, but also politics. She went to the DRC, she met with Kabila, and there were also some outsiders of the Treasury Department. Again, Trump appointees who helped push through some more sanctions. And Congress, by this time, under NGO pressure, was passing new legislation threatening sanctions. So finally, Kabila held the elections 2 years late. And as most of you know, USAID and other Western-funded Catholic Church observers reported that Kabila's designated heir, Shadari, lost overwhelmingly to Martin Fayulu. And the other opponent, major opposition guy, Felix Tshisekedi, he also lost badly. Kabila, though, decided to kind of designate Tshisekedi the winner, US, because he seemed to be the weaker opposition candidate. US went along. And the Secretary of State followed, again, the recommendations of the Africa Bureau. The Africa Bureau accepted the US Embassy's skepticism about the church's figures. They said, well, we don't know who won the election. A lot of their skepticism, though, is based on what happens with these bureaucracies. They kind of believe DRC government misinformation about how many observers there were and how the church was biased and that sort of thing. Still, unhappy African Union leaders and European Union officials pushed for a negotiated political solution. US said no. Why? The US policymakers had concluded that if the election were challenged, Kabila might just cancel it, annul the results, and stay in power, and this would precipitate violence. So once again, the bureaucratic habit of getting too close to a client government and avoiding short-term risks prevailed. Many of the US officials later said to me, well, we might have been able to just, if we'd stuck with the Europeans and the Africans, we might have been able to persuade Kabila to back down, because he often backed down under pressure. Okay, so Biden, finally. Leading up to the 2023 election, There was a lot of pro-democracy rhetoric from the Democratic Biden administration. And it did provide some added financial assistance to the elections. But more telling about the policy of the United States was the slow renewal of the church observers program. In the end, they put only about half the number of observers out that they had before, because other countries had not been pushed enough, perhaps, to complement the U.S. aid. The State Department criticized some of the issues that everybody knows about these last elections. The lack of truly independent audit, the recurrent repression of political opponents, journalists, and civil society, the packing of the election commission and court with government supporters. But when they criticized it, there was no threat of consequences. So the DRC government didn't really have to listen to them. And at the end of the election, of course, as in 2018, the Biden administration, just like the Trump administration, officially endorsed the key presidential results and the elections, even though they were very chaotic, as Eric and others have shown. And they almost certainly magnified, or, Tshisekedi's and his loyal legislators' margin of victory. So a key ingredient of democracy, the existence of significant opposition in parliament, is missing. Again, most important actor in all these three last administrations continues to be the Africa Bureau of the State Department. There's been some speculation, well, maybe higher levels of the US government are now anxious to keep Tshisekedi close to prevent the Chinese, who control the mining industry in the DRC, from withholding cobalt, which we need for electric car batteries. I don't find much support for this. The administration made their own analysis of the cobalt supply problem in 2021, and it did not emphasize the danger of the DRC cobalt falling into the hands of China and being kept away, but rather it said the main problem, supply issue problem, was a history of political instability in the DRC itself. And I think we can go into this. Recent actions of the United States to help promote more access to cobalt are relatively modest. Okay, so finally, in conclusion, and I think I actually got within my 30 to 40 minutes, I'd argue that from the beginning, the real US national interest in the DRC, which is sub-Saharan Africa's largest and most strategically located state, is to nurture a long-term relationship. It has been to do that, to nurture a long-term relationship with a politically stable country, even though it may have different governments, one that has more or less effective, accountable governance, as much as can be achieved. Such a country would also ensure uninterrupted access to and protection of key natural resources. In my view, the best way to advance that objective would have been to be guided as much as possible by America's own official anti-colonial and democratic values. As a superpower engaged in an intense Cold War, America is naturally drawn into the Congo decolonization crisis. Yet its elite foreign policy leaders, driven by their domestic, social, and political affiliations, and previous international experiences, misunderstood Congo politics, and the results have been disastrous. As the Cold War then drew toward an end, policymaking gravitated downward to the Africa Bureau and the State Department. But that bureau, stamped by its early experience in the Congo, mired in bureaucratic risk aversion, prioritized a close relationship to a traditional friendly government and just short-term stability. Little progress was made toward long-term effective accountable governance. Outsiders, whether from US NGOs or Congress or parts of the executive branch sometimes, occasionally influenced US policy, favorably in many respects. But their long-term impact was hampered by the limited political constituency in the United States for Africa. In the absence of political leaders prepared to make necessary reforms of the State Department bureaucracy, or unanticipated new developments, U.S. policy is likely to continue on the path that I first discovered as a young congressional staffer 45 years ago. Please let me have your questions and discussion.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor, for this fascinating presentation, where you had tried to understand the American foreign policy from I think, two main perspectives. The first one is about an elite analysis and the worldview analysis and the effect it had on the interpretation of Congolese policy of the U.S. towards the Congo, and the second one, the role of bureaucracy. I will abuse my position to ask the first two questions if you allow me to. The first one is on the 60s. I presume that a worldview of policymakers, which is linked to the social background and experience, that this is something that is important within the determinants of national strategic interests. So I was just wondering, so the U.S. policy in that time, they could have chosen between several alternatives in terms of support for political elites in the Congo. I mean, did they make a choice within the parameters of strategic interest of the United States, or did they perceive that did they also have another perception of strategic interest of the United States, which maybe determined also their preference for the Adula government and others? So it was a relative weight in a sense of their social background and strategic interest of the country, which I presume or go beyond even perception by social group. Then the second one, which is more linked to current events, I'm a little bit surprised that you say the bureaucracy took over from after the 60s until now. Now the perception certainly in the Congo is of course completely different. When the war started with the AFDL in 96, 97, it was said that the Clinton administration actively supported the war, actively supported Rwanda, Uganda. And also in the current period, there is also much talk about critical materials, critical minerals, and that the U.S. policy is also driven by this interest for critical materials. But you seem to not to attach too much importance to this on the basis of the 2021 analysis of cobalt. There is much talk about the importance of tantalum, as you know, and also for the U.S. So maybe you think there's also an exaggeration that in reality those are factors that are less important. Those are a bit the two questions I would like to, before giving the floor to the participants.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I mean, my view is that all the administrations recognized some strategic interest in the Congo in the sense that it's a very big, important country. The U.S. wants to have a relationship with it. Of course, in the beginning, what happened in the Congo was being seen all over the world. So it was going to affect the relationship, for example, with the new countries in Africa that were becoming independent. But the point I'm making is it's not so much that all the different people have different evaluations of the strategic interest. It's that how do you go about realizing the strategic interest? That is the controversy. And the people from the conservative backgrounds in the Eisenhower administration said, oh, well, we can only protect our strategic interest by getting rid of Lumumba because he's a crazy pro-communist guy. And the liberals who followed him, they didn't like Lumumba very much either, but they recognized, well, he wasn't as crazy as they say he is. You know, maybe he would be sort of tilt toward the communists, but you know, he wasn't that bad. They had first even allowed the Adula government to include Lumumbists. So it was their backgrounds, their greater understanding of nationalism that enabled them to be more flexible. The same thing about Katanga. You know, if you have a strategic interest in Congo, then if you support the Belgians in Katanga, you're doing it not because of your strategic interest in the Congo, but because you think that, well, the Belgians have a right to do this. They can protect the Europeans. Chambe, the leader of the Katanga, is a reasonable person. Um, and let's see, I just got a message to start my video. You're not seeing me in the video?
Well, not in the central part, just in a small.
In the small part, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening.
Okay, I'll work on that after this answer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, they're basically the conservatives sympathize with Katanga, even though they see there's a strategic interest in the Congo. Say, well, maybe the Congo can be reconstructed someday with a big role for Katanga, because Katanga is like the kind of thing we like. And the liberals say, no, no, that's terrible. All the Africans hate this white-ruled or white-influenced regime in Katanga. We have to get rid of it. So what I'm saying is that they may all agree on the strategic interest, but they have different interpretations of how they can go about it. In terms of the other things you mentioned about the higher level maybe is more interested in things like Rwanda and Uganda, I agree with that. When it becomes a big regional issue, when it could, result in another world war in Africa, the higher levels do get involved. That's what I mentioned. Now, about critical materials, in addition to, and I've talked to people in the cobalt industry, nobody thinks that the DRC government would ever want to withhold cobalt from the West. There's no indication of that. And it never has been. It's a nationalist government, whoever is in power, that doesn't want to just depend on one side. So, and is also dependent on the West for its markets and its foreign aid, international financial institutions. So there's not really a threat. If there's any threat that ever develops to critical materials from China, it's really the Chinese control 80% of the refining of the world's cobalt. There aren't any refineries any other place, except for the other 20%. So China could say, okay, no more cobalt in the world. If the world didn't have any refineries, nothing they could do about it. It has nothing to do with the DRC. It has nothing to do with Tshisekedi or anybody else withholding cobalt. So the real solution would be, if you're afraid of that, and most people I don't think are that afraid of it, build refineries all over the place. Now, the U.S. is spending a lot of money building for semiconductor chip factories, subsidizing it, manufacturing new industries in the United States and elsewhere. They're not building cobalt refineries. They're not guarding against this. So, this reminds me of late 1970s when I was actually working for Congress. Some congressmen said, well, there's going to be a resource war. The communists are going to take over not only Zaire, but Southern Africa, and then they'll deny all these resources to the United States. Well, some of the congressmen, especially from mining states, were saying that so they could get their minds going. But the US government didn't think so. For the Soviet Union to get control would be one thing, very doubtful, of all this region. And then second, to withhold all of it, all these minerals from the United States, would be like an act of war.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I see that because this is especially for the second part, is really a hot topic in the Congo, as you know, where there's a lot of probably inaccurate information circulating. Now, until now, we only have 2 questions. So please, if you have questions, please put them on the Q&A board panel. The first one is about an anonymous attendee saying that considering the historical context of USA involvement in the Congo from the 60s to the present, how does the recent condemnation by the US of Rwanda's alleged support for M23 rebel group in the Kivu region reflect on its current foreign policy objectives in Central Africa? And in light of this condemnation, what steps is the USA taking or planning to take to address the complex dynamics of support and influence among neighboring countries in the region? And how does it intend to balance its strategic interests with the promotion of stability and peace in the Great Lakes region. So I don't know if if it's possible to give an answer because it's a very complex question.
Yes, I agree. I would point out one thing that may be useful to the person who asked the question. The United States has rightfully condemned Rwanda's support of M23. And it has also quietly suspended military assistance to Rwanda. What it has not done is strongly pushed other allies of the United States to also take a strong position. And what it has not done has been to encourage them also to withhold economic aid. In other words, there's not enough pressure yet, maybe there will be, on Rwanda. In 2012 and 13, when this same issue was there, the United States, as I mentioned, at the higher levels became interested in the regional issues, did take these positions. It did push others to stop economic aid. It was much tougher. And what we're dealing with today is Rwanda, has chosen or carved out a role that seems useful to the West as providing peacekeeping forces in a couple of countries, such as Mozambique, for example, and I think Sudan, and they are now being contemplated as a place where Britain would send refugees and so forth. So Rwanda has built itself up so the US may be, I'm not saying I'm certain of this, less strong in pushing and less capable of moving its allies and pushing for Rwanda to be more responsible. So I think that's the concern that I would have right now. I don't think I'm revealing anything too confidential, but a good friend of mine was told by the current U.S. ambassador at the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who I mentioned in my talk, used to be the head of the Africa Bureau, that the UN and US will never support, that strong a pressure on Rwanda like DRC wants, and that even a lot of African countries won't support it. So one would have to look more closely at that, but that's where I believe the issue stands right now.
And if I may just add, why do you think they would never allow such kind of pressure on Rwanda?
Well, I think, as I say, it's a combination of things. It's the allies, and the U.S. have become more dependent in various ways on Rwandan support and the rest of Africa and the world. And it's possible that the Biden administration, though sympathetic to the DRC on this issue, may be less energetic than the Obama administration was. Remember, the Obama administration had a special envoy named former Senator Russell Feingold, who played a very important role in pushing against Rwanda. And right now, the Biden administration, even though our group, our Congo working group, and others said, please appoint a new special envoy to get out of the State Department bureaucracy sort of thing, the Biden administration has so far not appointed a special envoy. So that if you don't have a special envoy, you don't have someone whose priority is the region itself rather than the country that they're representing the US in, and can push beyond one country for US policy and the State Department to be more responsive.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Well, there's a question by Mrs. Gloria Atamiklo, sorry. She would like to know about the role played by the organization like Peace Corps and NGOs, and also the role played by military and economic aid to influence the Congo policy along the US policy interests. What does it mean in general, so for international NGOs, because they get the funding from American, European donors and governments, are they also an extension of their government donors?
Okay, let me start with that last interesting, very interesting point, and then we can maybe go to the other points. the groups that I've worked with since I left the Congress and resumed my interest in the U.S. foreign policy toward the Congo are groups that some of them may receive some government money, but they're essentially independent of the government. Groups like the formerly named group Enough, now it's called Century, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. There were some humanitarian organizations, and these organizations can develop their own orientation. Sometimes they do have difficulty because they may have other interests than a foreign policy toward the Congo, or they may get some funding from the government. So maybe they can't always sign a letter, but they can attend a meeting and they can talk at the meeting about their concerns. So these groups were extremely important in a couple of the periods of U.S. foreign policy that I've described. They have been especially important, I think, recently. The very formation of this Congo working group, as I described it, came out of a lot of the concerns that began to emerge both regionally and in the Congo in the 2012-13 period. So they can be very influential. As for the other questions, the Peace Corps isn't really independent of the U.S. government. It's kind of it's part of the U.S. government. That doesn't mean that it has to follow everything the U.S. government wants it to do, but it can't take a stand against it. But, you know, to take another example, at an individual level, sometimes the Peace Corps people can be very important. When I was working for Congress, a lot of the Peace Corps volunteers would write letters to the congressman saying, oh, gosh, we're concerned about this, concerned about that. They were just individuals. And yet we tried to take these letters seriously, investigate some of these problems. I personally knew a Peace Corps director that time that I was in the Congo, and we had this big conflict with the ambassador and met Mobutu. And I had personally known the Peace Corps director because he had also been a professor. And he really clued me in on, because he's part of the embassy. He clued me in, well, this is the way the embassy's thinking. And because the Peace Corps people had a lot of contacts also with individuals, the average person, you might say, in the DR, in the Congo, they kind of gave more of a grassroots understanding. And as I mentioned, the ambassador wouldn't even let the political officers talk to the opposition. But there was another part of the question. I don't know if you remember it, Eric, right between those two parts.
Well, no, I think the question in general was to what extent the Peace Corps NGOs and also so international NGOs, because they get the budget from European American governments, are they used as an instrument for the policy of these American for the American and European government. So, yeah. But I think you answered the question.
Okay, I thought there was another part right between those two aspects that you might, if you have it in writing, it might be useful to comment on.
Well, I think it was, well, the question was about how the U.S. use organizations like Peace Corps, NGOs, along with military and economic aid to influence Congo in the direction of the policy interests.
Yes, and the military and economic aid aspect. Mm-hmm. When I was working on it, Mobutu wasted all military aid. In other words, they would send them, you know, an airplane and they'd use it for business. They wouldn't use it for military. or they'd sell the equipment, or they'd use the jeeps to go and extort money from the peasant. So it wasn't really military aid. It was basically Mobutu wanted it because he thought that meant I can show the people that the U.S. supports me. So they're not going to rebel against me. They know the U.S. supports me. See the jeeps, see the aircraft, so forth. And some of the administration people, they also realized that the aid was useless. The people, for example, that I would interact with who worked for the Defense Department, the Pentagon, they would say, we don't want to give this aid. The State Department makes us do this, but we can use aid, all this money for military aid better in other countries. But the State Department said, well, if we give him military aid, maybe we can persuade him a little more to do reforms because he wants it. So we can use that to say, okay, now be good with the IMF, meet their conditions. Or maybe you can kind of allow a little more opposition. But these really became rationalizations. There was no evidence that this 10 million or whatever it was military aid would fundamentally change the regime's calculations. So there's a real question in my mind about how useful aid was. We also, for example, one last example, were critical of food aid. You say, wow, food aid? How can you be critical of food aid to a country like Zaire with a huge malnutrition rate and so forth? Well, the problem was that they were corrupting the food. They was taking the food and selling it in the Brazzaville markets instead of getting it to the people. One of the congressmen, before I came to Washington, he'd actually gone there and seen, this diversion of the food. And then they would generate what they called counterpart funds. People would sell the food, get money, and so forth. And the money could be used for other constructive activities. But instead of using it for development, they lent it to cronies of the regime and never asked to have it paid back. So you have to be very careful with aid. To me, the most reliable aid is health aid. You just vaccines, or stuff like that. We know that just immediate delivery of that can help people very much. But a lot of the other aid, complicated projects, often were failures because the regime was a failure, because it didn't build the roads it promised, because it didn't force people who are marketing corn or whatever to pay a good price, allow them to extort from the peasants and so forth. So it has to be looked at carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is a bit similar to the previous one. There's a lady who's asking about the influence of NGOs and the Catholic Church on U.S. policy. And she was thinking about the building of mega churches in the 80s. So I think the question is about how the growing influence of Catholic Church and the NGOs is also reflected on U.S. policy. And then, but you dealt partly with this. And then the second one is, why do successive U.S. governments allow or accept the bureaucratic syndrome you referred to?
Okay, well, let me take the second one first. The bureaucratic syndrome is fairly spread about in society. Organizations tend to behave this way, to get enclosed on themselves to protect their organizational advantages. But it can change if the higher ups say this isn't working. It doesn't work anymore to listen to these people. To take one example from the Congo, before the Kennedy administration, the European Bureau in the State Department, which just focused on protecting European relations, was much more powerful than the Africa Bureau. In fact, the Africa Bureau had not even been formed till 1958. There were more US diplomats in West Germany than entire Africa in 1960, the entire continent. There was more US diplomats in one country. So that organization, pursuing its own interests, always was pushing, don't do anything to Katanga. And what happened was the top levels of the US government determined they weren't going to listen to that bureau anymore. And they were going to basically promote the Africa Bureau more. And so that changed the balance of power between the bureaus. So that's one thing that can happen. Also, I mean, organizations can be reformed. I mean, people know that if there's a political will, you could go and start to change the State Department. You could start to make it, for example, less hierarchical, that the people are always afraid of being fired, getting a bad evaluation, and so forth. You could open it up more, have more appeal possibilities if your boss is coming down too hard on you. There could be just more incentives saying, okay, we're going to promote people who have new ideas. Even if we don't like them, we want to encourage them. We'll give them more money. We'll give them more awards. I mean, there are all kinds, and these are lessons from other organizations. So you can bring in outsiders and so forth to begin to shake up organizations. An outsider can come in and say, okay, I've never been part of this group. This group is just too much in this bureaucratic syndrome. I'm going to put new leaders in. I'm going to change incentives and that sort of thing. So in terms of the church groups and others and their influence on policy, I have to pay tribute to the American Council Conference of Catholic Bishops, because they decided at a certain point to support the church in the DRC and as part of their work. And the church in the DRC is probably the most legitimate organization in the country. Catholic Church, and recently the Protestant Church has allied itself, the main Protestant Church, with the Catholic Church. So they have had an influence in pushing for elections in 2018. Write letters, talk to congressmen, talk to the administration. Because they were so important to group in the United States, often they're the only ones who could get to see the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa from the outside. So the churches really, and working with their counterpart organizations in Africa, can have a major role.
Okay, thank you very much. So next one is more about economics. So you mentioned that if the DRC wants to become more independent, they should construct refineries, build refineries. Now, question was, how do you motivate Western companies to invest in refineries in strategic minerals in the Congo? And there's no problem for energy because they have immense potential for hydropower.
Right. Well, in terms of refineries, I was talking the refineries could be in the DRC. There is an agreement with between the United States has supported with the DRC and Zambia to create an integrated industry producing batteries. I think it might be in Zambia, but it's a collaborative agreement. So that I believe there is refining projected to be associated with that. That's fine. But basically, the way the United States and others have promoted refineries, if they want to diversify the source of the material, is to promote it in their own countries. Now, the United States is spending a lot of money promoting electric cars. They're giving tax incentives for people to buy the cars and for industry to produce them. They are, they just passed a major multi-billion-dollar bill, for the manufacturing of computer chips, semiconductor chips, subsidized by the United States. So if it was such a big problem that they were afraid that China would monopolize DRC cobalt through its domination of the refining of it, they could just say, okay, we are going to provide subsidies to build refineries for cobalt, copper, maybe in the United States. So that, I mean, but they haven't done so. So that makes me wonder whether they really are that afraid, given their previous analysis. I don't think they are, that China would somehow cut off the United States from and other countries from cobalt supplies. Mentioned energy also. And you know, a lot of the problems in the DRC, they have all this hydroelectric energy. It can't be used, you know, to refine cobalt or produce cobalt for batteries. But yes, they have all this energy, but often a lot of these projects have failed because you know, there's corruption, there's incompetence, there's not effective governance. And there's been different stages of the Inga power projects, and some of them have not gone very far. They kept talking about it, but what is actually, you know, occurring is often disappointing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. There is also, I think, Professor Herbert Weiss, whom we really have the pleasure to have with us among the participants. I think he would like to put a question orally, if I am not mistaken. Professor Weiss? No, maybe he's not. I'm sorry, there was a written comment from him. Otherwise, we go to the next written question. There's a lady, Catherine London, who asks that there is a considerable amount of Congolese historiography on the issues you talked about and about political activist direct involvement. Do you get a different view or analysis of US actions from these sources, as indeed the analysis of US policy in the Congo is very much different of yours, and I don't know whether they're based on the same, really based on solid data. So do you get a different view of analysis of US actions from these Congolese sources?
Right. Well, I mean, in terms of Congolese professional sources, people like, I'll give an example, George Zongola Ntalaja, who is a very famous Congolese political scientist, a former president of the Studies Association in the United States, now a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has written excellent books on the DRC. We also, when I was part of the working group, Congo working group, we were in touch with Congolese civil society actors who had very sophisticated views, people like Fred Boma, and people from the church, and Congolese intellectuals. So I think that you know, we are in touch with many Congolese. It would be great, if, of course, if we had even more Congolese writing about these things. You know, there are just not enough of them who have actually analyzed using archives, using interviews, using participant observation, and so forth, the making of American foreign policy. So a lot of the authors, you know, that you read are people who are, you know, American political scientists, Belgian political scientists, British political scientists, and so forth. Nonetheless, I think that for those who are looking at it in the Congo, and Congolese who are here in the United States, you know, and of course I've had a lot of contact over the years with Congolese parliamentarians, Congolese political figures. I think that my analysis is not necessarily inconsistent, but if there's somebody who the questioner wants to say, okay, what do you think of this person's analysis, I'd be happy to, you know, look at that.
Okay, well, we still have 13 minutes left, so maybe there's time for the two last questions. The lady who refers to the title we gave at the webinar or the explanation, so that Professor Weissman provides a uniquely informed perspective on this issue based on his groundbreaking research on the CIA's Congo interventions in the 60s. Indeed, I mean, I forgot to mention the important work of Professor Weissman on the Lumumba assassination and on the role the CIA has played in it. So I think the question was, is the CIA intervention related to the events with Lumumba, or were there other interventions, I presume from the CIA, relevant for Congo policy?
Yes. Well, the CIA, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, though I've written an article called An Extraordinary Rendition about the CIA and the assassination of Lumumba that was published in a journal, Intelligence and National Security. And I've written elsewhere about the CIA in the Congo, including in Foreign Affairs magazine. Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA, and he was among the Eisenhower policymakers. He had a similar background, upper class, wealthy lawyer, corporate lawyer, but he also was a product of his agency, which was under very loose supervision, and they just, ready to go ahead and, do direct action, as they called it. They plotted to kill Castro. There was a plot to kill Sukarno in Indonesia, and so forth. So they became an instrument, let's say, of the Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson administrations throughout almost the whole 1960s in the DRC. So I was focused in my talk on making the policy. And of course, there are instruments. Foreign aid is one of them, economic aid, military aid, so forth. And there was overt aid. But also, this covert activity was extremely important. It was the United States that, just helped with Belgium. A lot of Belgian and American authors focus only on their country, but both of them together were paying all the same people. So they all knew about it, each other, and they were displacing Lumumba. They were transferring him to a place where he'd be killed, or urging their Congolese proteges to transfer him to a place where he'd be killed. They were corrupting the big meeting in 1961 at Lovanium, where, especially the United States at that point, the CIA, where they were going to have everybody represented in Parliament reconvened, and it would look like the leftist Lumumba was going to get elected prime minister, so they put all their money on a doula, bribed all these people. So these were obviously very important. They provided a Cuban exile manned air force to bomb rebels that killed thousands and thousands of people. Belgians came in and provided officers at the same time. That was overt. The CIA thing was supposedly covert. And the CIA basically helped make the 1965 coup of Mobutu. And generally, in my view, were not a very constructive force. So they were very important in this. But since the 70s, I think they still were doing some bodyguard training in the early 70s. But since then, really hasn't been the CIA. They have not been used as an instrument. And the US has given overt aid, as in the Shaba crisis, which Eric has really brilliantly portrayed in his own book. But so the CIA was very important in really the founding of American policy toward the Congo. And as I tried to point out in my talk, those founding elements have persisted to the present day. People are still looking back and say, oh, without the CIA having done this, the whole place would have fallen apart. Or back in the 80s, they say, well, maybe Mobutu is kind of not doing a good job, but he's our man. What do they mean by that? They meant he was the CIA's man. And tell you one tiny story, since we still have time, one tiny story. When I first began to work for Congress, we were challenging, the congressman I worked for were challenging military aid to Mobutu. And Deputy Assistant Secretary of Africa came into the chairman of my subcommittee's office, and I was there. And he was trying to argue, oh, we have to give this military aid. And my boss, the congressman, was resisting. So and I talk about this in the book, the Deputy Assistant Secretary suddenly lowered his voice, came close to the congressman, said, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but when we really needed help in the Congo, Mobutu was there. And what he meant, to me, that was acknowledging what I had gotten from other diplomats from my first book, that, yeah, he was the CIA's guy. And that same idea persisted 20 years after he'd been the CIA's guy. 20 years after 1960, this Deputy Assistant Secretary was talking about what? The CIA operation. So it had a long-lasting effect on US policymakers. He's our guy. Similar to Charles Wren.
Okay, well, that's a bit of a also a bit of a sobering view about the level of knowledge that foreign administration can have about the situation in the Congo. I think maybe we have time for one last question, which is about a slightly different subject, notably the cooperation with the US and the European Union. So the question is, Professor, if you could identify and elaborate on pivotal moments or specific policies that highlight the nature of US and EU relations, so either cooperation or conflict in the Congo, and how do these incidents or policies influenced the DRC's political, economic, and social landscape? It's a very complex question. And then the second part is, how do you envision the future of the cooperation between the US and the European Union in the future, especially in promoting stability, democratic governments, and economic development?
Well, there has been cooperation, for example, in sanctions, supporting governance, democracy and governance that were taken by the United States and the European Union. Sometimes one preceded the other, different ways, during the recent period. And certainly when the United States has called for elections or denounced human rights, so has the European Union. So in that respect, they've been very similar. The problem is that they often, when a crucial moment arrives in this process, as it did in 2018, the United States took one position and the European Union took another one. And actually, in my view, the European Union, which was supporting the African Union, which wanted to negotiate after the fraudulent election, to force Kabila to negotiate about a solution and not just accept Tshisekedi at that point blindly because Kabila wanted him. The US rejected that. And a strong European Union, I would have hoped, it isn't, of course, as strong a governmental presence, would have been more critical of the United States, and European governments would then have kind of said, no, we want to support the effort of African leaders to negotiate. So I think the European Union had the right position, but and eventually at the end of the election, the US said, oh, this is the great thing. The peaceful democratic process wasn't democratic. And the European Union said, well, we just take note of it, just like this time. This time, the US congratulated Tshisekedi when he won the election, and the European Union said, we'll be taking note of it, because they know about the chaos during the election. But the European Union, or the governments behind the European Union, have not, to me, been strong enough in pushing the US. And a US Assistant Secretary of State during the 2018 period told me the day after the US made that kind of weak statement, he got calls from all these European governments saying, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have called it democratic. What'd you do that for? But that's kind of ineffectual. You know, if So it seems to me that, especially after 1960, the US has assumed the lead among the Western countries in the DRC. The other governments are important, their pressures are important too. But if the European Union is truly interested in promoting long term effective governance, it will need to persuade some of its sponsors to be more active and more energetic in pushing the United States in that direction.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. I think we are near to the end of our talk. Fascinating, really, absolutely fascinating talk. And maybe we could organize the next one about European Union policies towards the Congo. I can only hope that your latest book will be translated into French also, so that it will be read in Congo. And second wish is that you write a sequel about the U.S. policy from the 90s until 2024, because I think there's also a lot of sound analysis really missing on this topic, and it fuels a lot of speculation. So many thanks again for your participation and your willingness to share your insights with all of us, with all the participants.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, and to everybody who is listening to this, watching this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll, if you're on the list, you will receive the next events from Egmont Institute's Africa program, and I hope it will be as interesting as was today. So thank you very much, and have a nice day or a nice evening or a nice afternoon.